Night in that world did not feel like the absence of sunlight. It felt chosen. It felt deliberate. The sky above Wallachia was not merely dark but wounded, painted in bruised shades of crimson and black, as if the heavens themselves had been bled and left to rot. Along the mountain ridges, forests stood like rows of pikes, and beneath them villages smoldered in silence, their roofs caved in, their chapels broken, their roads littered with the forgotten shapes of carts, shoes, and bodies. Far above them all, piercing the clouds like a blade driven into the throat of the earth, Dracula's castle watched. It did not stand over the land as a fortress alone. It loomed as a verdict. Its shadow stretched across valleys and rivers and ruined farmland like a stain that no rain could wash away. This was a world already exhausted by terror. Humanity did not merely fear monsters here. It had adapted itself to fear as though fear were the final law of nature. Parents barred windows before sunset with trembling hands. Children learned to whisper instead of laugh. Priests stood before shattered altars and spoke of salvation with eyes that no longer believed their own mouths. The church, once crowned in authority, had become another rotten pillar in a collapsing world. Its symbols still hung from stone walls, but the holiness inside them had been hollowed out by cruelty, vanity, and cowardice. Vampires ruled from candlelit keeps like elegant tyrants. Night creatures roamed field and road like curses given muscle and teeth. It was a land where every prayer sounded late. On one such road where the mud had been churned with blood from an earlier massacre, the last survivors of a burned village ran through the dark with the breathless desperation of prey. Behind them came the night creatures. Some bounded on all fours like diseased wolves skinned into human shape. Others moved upright, armored in bone and sinew, their jaws parting in laughter that did not belong to living things. One carried the rusted church bell it had torn free from a tower and dragged it through the mud behind it like a trophy. Another wore a dead soldier's breastplate over a ribcage that still steamed. Their hunger was not hurried. That was what made it worse. They knew these humans were already caught. Then the sky tore open. There was no warning. No thunder before it. No prayer that summoned it. One moment the clouds churned over the mountains, and the next a jagged wound of scarlet fire ripped across the heavens above the battlefield, spilling out a light so unnatural that even the night creatures slowed. It burned like a doorway forced open from the wrong side of creation. Wind screamed down from the fracture. Ash and frost swirled together. The fleeing villagers fell to their knees or covered their heads, convinced the world was finally splitting apart. Out of that crimson breach something fell. It did not tumble helplessly. It descended like a cannonball thrown by a god. The impact shattered the road. Mud and broken stone exploded outward. The closest night creature was ripped in half by the force before the smoke had even settled. Silence hit the field for one strange heartbeat. Then, through the crater, a shape rose from one knee. He was red, not with blood, though there was blood around him, red like old iron left in a furnace. Broad-shouldered, huge, heavy with a kind of physical certainty the world around him did not seem prepared to contain. His horns had been filed down into blunt ridges, leaving him the look of something that had once been more terrible and had chosen, somehow, to restrain itself. One hand was flesh, thick and scarred. The other was massive, stony, unnatural, like the fist of an ancient idol broken off and attached to a living body. His coat hung heavy with ash and mud. His eyes, narrowed under the dark, carried the tired irritation of a man who had landed in yet another place that clearly hated him already. The villagers recoiled in horror. Some screamed. One old woman crossed herself so hard she nearly fell backward. A young man grabbed a broken spear and pointed it with shaking hands, though his fear made the weapon look ridiculous. To them it made perfect sense. The sky had opened over a cursed land, and from it had fallen a demon. Redskin. A stone fist. A presence that rolled off him like heat from a forge. In a world ruled by Dracula and haunted by forged abominations, why would this be anything else? The creatures answered first. They lunged not toward the humans but toward him. That was the first crack in the illusion. The biggest of them, a stitched brute with antlers nailed through its skull, charged with a roar that shook mud from the trees. The red stranger did not move until the last second. Then he turned, planted one boot, and drove his stone hand upward with a noise like a tomb door breaking. Bone burst. Teeth scattered. The creature rose off the ground and came apart in midair. Another leaped onto his back, claws carving through his coat, and he reached over his shoulder, caught it by the throat, and hurled it through a wagon hard enough to splinter both into the ditch. Two more rushed the villagers. He was suddenly there between them and the innocent, revolver flashing from his side with thunderous shots that ripped skulls apart in sprays of black vapor and blood. What followed did not look heroic in the clean, shining way holy stories like to imagine heroism. It looked brutal. It looked ugly. It looked necessary. He fought like a storm that had learned to hate cruelty personally. When the creature swarmed him, he met them with fists, gunfire, broken wheel spokes, torn stones, and raw, close violence. One he stamped into the road. Another he caught by the jaw and ripped free from the rest of its body. A winged thing swooped toward a child, and he fired once without looking, dropping it at the girl's feet before she even realized she had been targeted. Mud flew. Blood steamed. Limbs struck the ground and twitched like dying spiders. The villagers watched, first with terror, then with confusion, then with a silence so profound it almost became reverence. Because the demon was standing between them and the monsters. That contrast settled over the ruined road with more force than the portal itself. In this world, faces lied. Churches had become slaughterhouses. Men dressed in sacred robes had delivered innocents to fire. Vampires spoke with the manners of nobles while feeding like beasts. And now a creature that looked as though hell had signed its name upon his skin was the only thing on that road behaving like salvation. The shape of evil was familiar here. The meaning of evil was not. The villagers had spent so long surviving appearances that truth had become harder to recognize than horror. The last night creature backed away from him, hissing through a mouth full of human teeth. It did not lunge again. It was afraid. That, more than the killing, was what changed the air. Monsters feared him, not as rival, not as prey, but as something worse. Something they sensed beneath the skin and could not understand. The red stranger rolled one shoulder, flexed the fingers of his enormous stone hand, and stared the creature down with weary contempt. When it finally rushed him anyway, more desperate than brave, he grabbed it by the neck, slammed it into the crater where he had landed, and crushed its skull into the mud until the body stopped moving. For a while no one spoke. Fire crackled from the ruined carts. Wind moved through the dead grass. Somewhere in the valley a church bell rang once, then fell silent. The villagers kept their distance. Gratitude warred with fear on their faces, and fear was still winning. He noticed, of course. Men like him always noticed. He glanced over the bodies, over the broken road, over the terrified people who owed him their lives, and still looked ready to run from him. There was no surprise in his expression. Only that old familiar disappointment sharpened by exhaustion. One of the younger survivors finally managed to whisper what all the others were thinking. "What are you?" The red giant looked down at the blood on his fist, then at the mountain where Dracula's castle stabbed the sky. His mouth curled in something too dry to be called a smile. In another world he might have given a shorter answer. In this one, with the smell of death everywhere and the false holiness of the land hanging over everything like mildew, honesty seemed easier. "I have been called a monster before," he said, "but you guys make it look ugly." The road did not become kinder after that night. If anything, it seemed determined to prove that the slaughter on the muddy field had only been an introduction. Hellboy moved through the cursed land like a thrown stone skipping across the surface of despair. Never staying long, never welcomed, always arriving just in time to find another wound in the world still bleeding. Villages stood empty with doors left swinging open, meals cold on tables, cradles overturned beside the hearth. Chapels held bodies stacked before the altar as if the dead had come there out of habit, hoping holiness would remember them after the people who preached it had failed. In the distance, vampire banners hung from black towers with the lazy confidence of rulers who no longer needed to prove dominion. Every mile whispered the same lesson in a different accent. Human beings had not just been conquered here. They had been taught to expect abandonment. Hellboy had known ugly places before. He had seen old gods pulled from the dark. He had tracked monsters through ruins and listened to men in suits explain the end of the world over stale coffee. But this land was different because its misery felt intimate. It was not an apocalypse in one clean stroke. It was an endless habit of suffering. It was a universe in which evil had grown patient enough to become infrastructure. Roads led to massacres. Prayers led to graves. Nobility led to cruelty. He saw mothers hiding children in root cellars and leaving themselves outside as bait. He saw soldiers too hungry to stand properly trying to hold gates already soaked in claw marks. He saw priests who spoke of purity while condemning the desperate for sins committed in the act of surviving. And wherever he went, people saw him before they saw what he was doing. That part never changed. A scream in the dark. A cross held up with shaking hands. A panicked soldier loose with a trigger or blade. In one mountain village, a group of men tried to drag a church cannon into the street to blast him apart while he was busy tearing the spine out of a night creature that had climbed onto their roof. In another town, a priest shouted Latin over him so furiously that he nearly passed out, only to open his eyes and find the red demon carrying 2 children out of a burning stable. Some fled the instant they saw him. Some attacked first and asked questions only after he had saved their lives. None of it surprised him. But surprise was not the same thing as indifference. Every suspicious stare scraped at old scars. Every frightened face reminded him that in most worlds the first battle was never against monsters. It was against appearances. That irony made the land feel almost cruelly poetic. In a kingdom where men wrapped in sanctity had betrayed the innocent, where aristocrats in silk drained villages dry, where smiling scholars forged abominations in candlelit chambers, one of the only beings still acting like a guardian looked like he had crawled out of the deepest circle of hell. Hellboy understood the joke. He just did not think it was funny. Still, he kept moving. He saved whoever was in front of him, broke whatever needed breaking, lit cigars when he could find them, slept where roofs still stood, asked questions when people were brave enough to answer them. The name Dracula came up often, always with the same mixture of hate and inevitability people used for storms, kings, and plagues. As the days stretched on beneath an unfriendly sky, rumors began to move faster than he did. A red devil who shattered night creatures with his bare hands. A horned giant who carried silver bullets and laughed at death. A demon who broke vampire patrols and left their bodies in roadside ditches like warnings. Stories gathered around him because frightened people needed stories more than certainty. Some tales made him a herald of worse things to come. Others made him an avenger sent by a god the world no longer deserved. Both were wrong. But myths do not wait for accuracy, especially in a land starving for any shape that might interrupt despair. It was on a cold evening near the ruins of an old monastery that those rumors finally led the right people to him. Hellboy had just finished dealing with a nest of malformed creatures inside what had once been a wine cellar. The bodies smoked where they had fallen. He climbed back into the gray light carrying a broken lantern and a mood already ruined by the smell. The road beyond the monastery was lined with bare trees and drifting fog. Somewhere close, boots shifted over gravel. He paused, lowered the lantern, and sighed in the way only a man very used to ambushes could sigh. Trevor Belmont came first because of course he did. Fast, suspicious, and carrying the attitude of someone who had spent too many years solving problems by hitting them. The whip at his side flashed free before any greeting had the chance to exist. Sypha Belnades moved with him, flame already curling between her fingers, eyes narrowed not in fear but in calculation. Beside them stood a pale man in dark clothing, still and composed in a way that made his silence feel larger than the other's hostility. Alucard watched Hellboy not as a target but as a question. The clash happened almost automatically. Trevor did not ask what Hellboy wanted. He attacked like a man trying to end the problem before it learned to speak. The whip cracked through the air with alchemical force, silver sparks dancing along its length. Hellboy caught the second strike on his stone hand and answered with a backfest that shattered a section of monastery wall when Trevor ducked under it. Sypha moved next, a ribbon of ice cutting toward Hellboy's legs before turning to flame in the same breath. He dove through the heat, rolled, came up with the Samaritan drawn, and chose not to fire when he saw civilians sheltering in the broken courtyard behind them. Alucard entered the fight only then, sword flashing like moonlight, fast enough that Hellboy barely blocked the first blow in time. For a few sharp moments the ruins rang with violence. Trevor fought like a man who trusted pain more than assumptions. Sypha tested angles and energy, trying to understand what kind of thing could carry infernal presence without moving like a servant of hell. Alucard, meanwhile, watched Hellboy's decisions more carefully than his attacks. He noticed where the red stranger pulled his shots. He noticed how he shifted his body to draw blows away from the weak walls where frightened refugees hid. He noticed the strange restraint beneath the power. There was darkness around Hellboy. That much was obvious. But darkness alone was meaningless. Some shadows were chosen. Some were inherited. Some were resisted every waking day. The answer arrived before any of them could force it from words. A scream rose from the road below the monastery. Then another. A refugee wagon late to reach shelter had been overtaken by vampire outriders descending through the fog. Horses bucked. Men cried out. A child's voice cut through everything. Trevor broke eye contact first. Sypha turned. Alucard's posture changed. Hellboy did not hesitate at all. He simply holstered the gun, shoved past Trevor hard enough to stagger him, and launched himself over the broken monastery steps toward the ambush below. That was all the proof reality cared to provide. The fight on the road was fast and merciless. Hellboy hit the first vampire so hard it folded over the wagon rail like wet cloth. The second came in low with a curved blade and lost both sword and arm before it understood how strong he was. Trevor followed a heartbeat later, whip singing through the dusk, cursing while he fought because that was how he breathed. Sypha froze the muddy road beneath the horse's hooves to throw the attackers off balance, then lit the night with a wall of fire that boxed them in. Alucard moved through the chaos with cold precision, elegant and lethal, silver arcs drawing death where Hellboy's fists delivered impact. For the refugees huddled in the wagon, the scene must have looked impossible. A Belmont, a speaker magician, Dracula's own son, and a horned red giant fighting on the same side beneath the same darkening sky. When it was done, the road fell still except for the harsh breathing of survivors and the hiss of Sypha's dying flames. Trevor wiped blood from his mouth and stared at Hellboy with the expression of a man whose suspicion had just become inconvenient. Sypha studied the infernal energy around him again, but now there was curiosity in it where judgment had been. Alucard looked from the dead vampires to the trembling refugees gathering behind the wagon wheels, and then back to Hellboy, whose first instinct after killing monsters was to check whether the children were hurt. It was a small thing. Small things matter. One refugee woman, face gray with shock, reached toward Hellboy as if to thank him, then flinched from his skin before her hand made contact. Hellboy noticed that too. He always noticed. He stepped back to make it easier for her. Trevor saw the flicker of irritation buried under that choice. Sypha saw the patience. Alucard saw something sadder. He saw a man who had spent so long being mistaken for evil that he had learned how to give frightened people room to despise him in peace. The evening wind moved through the dead grass. Dracula's castle watched from far away, half hidden by cloud. Around the wagon the rescued breathed again. Above them all the night remained vast and merciless. Yet something had shifted. Not trust, not fully. Trust in this world came slowly, if it came at all. But recognition had begun. The three travelers had met many monsters. They knew the difference between hunger and restraint, between infernal power and infernal allegiance, between darkness worn as identity and darkness worn as burden. Alucard was the one who finally gave the truth a voice. He is not like the creatures my father commands. In Dracula's castle, news traveled differently than it did in the villages below. Among peasants, rumor passed from mouth to mouth, altered by fear and sharpened by hope. In the castle, information arrived like a ritual offering. It moved through scholars, spies, forge masters, and pale courtiers whose eyes never seemed to blink often enough. Reports were laid upon long tables under candlelight. Names were tested against old books. Witnesses were flayed for lies and rewarded for useful precision. Dracula had built not merely a fortress but an intelligence of darkness, and when darkness learned that something had begun cutting through its servants with alarming efficiency, it took notice. At first the reports amused him. A red demon wandering the cursed roads. A horned beast that crushed night creatures and broke vampire detachments without pledging itself to any lord. Another aberration. Another stray thing clawed loose from the underworld by the centuries' many fractures. Dracula had seen too much ancient horror to be impressed by novelty alone. His grief had hollowed out the part of him once interested in spectacle. The extermination of mankind remained his answer to a world that had murdered the only person who made it bearable. Compared to that vast certainty, one more monster on the road meant little. Then the details kept arriving, not just descriptions. Night creatures hesitating before him, infernal constructs behaving unpredictably in his presence, surviving vampires speaking of an aura they could neither place nor endure. One scholar, old enough to remember sealed manuscripts from before the current war, requested permission to consult forbidden archives beneath the observatory. Another brought fragments of older language recovered from demonic sigils scorched into the battlefield where the Red Stranger had first fallen. The name hidden in those fragments was incomplete at first, broken across dialects older than kingdoms. But once the pieces aligned, once dead alphabets and unholy genealogies formed a single thread, even Dracula's indifference shifted. Anung Un Rama. He repeated it softly in the library chamber while stormlight flickered through stained glass blackened by age and fire. The name did not belong to ordinary demonology. It belonged to prophecy, to apocalyptic liturgies written by things that saw worlds not as nations and histories but as kindling. There are names that describe a creature, and there are names that describe a function. This one was the latter. Anung Un Rama was not merely a demon in the language of old powers. It was a key, a breaker, a royal syllable in the vocabulary of endings. Around Dracula, his court grew tense without fully understanding why. Vampire generals knew conquest. Scholars knew lore. Forge masters knew how to sculpt suffering into obedient flesh. But all of them understood the change in their king's silence. Interest had replaced dismissal, and interest from Dracula was more dangerous than rage. He demanded every surviving manuscript on infernal kingship and dimensional breach. He ordered Hector's abandoned notes and Isaac's darker Forgemaster records examined for references to convergence rituals, bloodline catalysts, and gates between worlds. The castle obeyed because castles ruled by immortal grief learn the shapes of obedience quickly. Meanwhile, far below those towers of stone and storm, Hellboy learned more about the man whose shadow had consumed the land. Trevor told the history in pieces because Trevor Belmont trusted fragments more than speeches. Sypha filled in what legend and scholarship had preserved. Alucard said less, but when he did speak, the weight of blood made each sentence heavier. They told Hellboy about Lisa, about the woman who had looked at Dracula and seen not a lord of nightmares, but a being capable of learning gentleness. They told him how mankind answered her kindness with accusation and flame. They told him how grief had opened into extermination, how one man's wound, empowered by ancient knowledge and immortal wrath, had become a war against the species that made the wound. Hellboy listened more than he argued. That too surprised them. He understood anger that curdled into contempt. He understood what it meant to be judged by frightened fools in robes and uniforms. He understood the deep and ugly temptation of deciding humanity was not worth the effort. There had been moments in his own life when the world's suspicion sat on him like lead, when every accusation seemed almost eager to become a prophecy. He knew the emotional mathematics of resentment. He knew how easy it would be to stand apart from humanity and conclude that the distance was deserved. But extermination was another thing. There was a difference between being wounded by the world and appointing yourself its executioner. Hellboy could understand Dracula's grief and still reject the answer it had produced. If anything, understanding made the rejection sharper. A beast that had never known love could be condemned plainly. A man who had known it and chosen slaughter afterward was more dangerous because the path made sense. That was the trap. Evil rarely announced itself as irrational to the one carrying it. It often arrived dressed as justice, especially when fed by pain. That philosophical mirror drew tighter around them with every step toward the castle. Dracula was what grief became when power and pride refused limits. Hellboy was what prophecy failed to account for when choice remained alive. Both were marked by monstrous inheritance. Both could look at mankind and find reasons to despise it. The difference lay in the answer each gave to that knowledge. Dracula looked at a cruel world and decided it deserved extinction. Hellboy looked at a cruel world and kept pulling children out of burning buildings anyway. One was a monster created by suffering. The other was a monster refusing instruction. In the halls above, Dracula came to the same conclusion from the opposite direction. If the red demon truly was Anung Un Rama, then killing him outright would be a waste. Awaken him instead and the war changes shape. Dracula had already brought kingdoms to ruin through force, but force was blunt. prophecy was precise. If Hellboy's dormant nature could be stirred to its full expression, if the being hidden beneath the filed horns and stubborn will could be drawn up through blood, pain, ritual, and environment, then the world would not merely end by military conquest. It could be remade. Castlevania itself, already soaked in death, could become the first pillar in a new order of darkness. Earth could be transformed from a battlefield into a domain where humanity no longer had any claim at all. That idea did not thrill Dracula in the childish way conquest might thrill lesser tyrants. It interested him with the cold focus of a mathematician who has discovered a more elegant proof. His scholars explain that Hellboy's arrival through an interdimensional rupture might indicate convergence already in motion. The castle had long fed upon chaos, blood, and forbidden geometry. Its shifting halls, impossible mechanics, and occult engines were not entirely separate from the metaphysical architecture of hellish realms. If linked to a true apocalyptic air, the structure might transcend even its current monstrosity. It could become a living gate, a throne room for the end of man. Yet perhaps the deepest interest Dracula felt was not strategic at all. It was personal. In Hellboy, he sensed not only utility but reflection. Another being told by birth what role he should play. Another figure burdened by the expectations of blood. Another man standing at the border between sorrow and annihilation. Dracula had surrendered to that border and crossed it. He wanted to know whether the red demon would do the same if shown enough truth, enough temptation, enough reason. Outside, thunder walked the mountains. Lightning flashed over the black towers and turned every window of the castle into a cold white eye. Dracula stood before one of them with hands clasped behind his back while the scholars knelt and the courtiers kept wisely silent. His gaze moved not to the villages below but to the storm itself, as though storms had become easier to understand than people. "Bring me the red demon," he said at last. The world may already belong to him. By the time they crossed into the deepest stretch of vampire-ruled territory, even the landscape seemed to understand that something older than war was waking. Roads bent where no road should bend. Hills changed shape beneath moonlight. Ruined watchtowers appeared on one ridge at dusk, and on another by dawn, as if the land had begun forgetting its own arrangement. Trevor complained because Trevor distrusted anything he could not insult properly. Sypha treated the distortions as evidence of layered magic, the kind that accumulated through centuries of ritual, death, and deliberate abuse of natural law. Alucard said little. He did not need to. The closer they drew to Dracula's castle, the more the silence around him became a silence of memory. Hellboy felt it in a different way. Recognition. The same ugly instinct that told him when a room contained a curse or a relic that wanted too much. Since arriving in this world, he had been surrounded by infernal echoes, but now those echoes were organizing themselves around him. At the edge of abandoned hamlets, gargoyles turned their stone heads after he passed. In desecrated chapels, soot-stained symbols appeared overnight on walls that had been blank at sunset. Once, deep in a forest choked with black pines, a patrol of night creatures emerged from the fog and dropped to one knee instead of attacking. They trembled like hounds caught between obedience and terror. Hellboy stared at them, disgust souring his expression. Trevor killed the nearest one on instinct. The others fled, shrieking into the dark. The castle was recognizing him before he had even entered it. That truth settled over the group with a heaviness none of them enjoyed naming. It would have been easier if Hellboy were simply a strong outsider, another weapon thrown against Dracula from some distant and inconvenient corner of existence. But the deeper they went, the harder that explanation held. Doors hidden beneath ivy swung open at his approach. Old locks cracked without being touched. One corridor beneath a dead abbey revealed itself only when Hellboy stepped upon the final stone and the wall peeled back like skin from muscle. Sypha watched all of it with the fascination of a scholar and the caution of a woman clever enough to fear what fascinated her. Trevor's suspicion, having finally stopped aiming outward, began to turn toward possibilities. Alucard understood first that the castle's response was not random. It was ceremonial. They descended through forgotten tunnels beneath a ruined fortress and found evidence that Dracula's war was only the surface of a deeper design. The lower chambers were not military. They were liturgical. Great circles had been carved into the floor and filled with layers of ash, blood, powdered bone, and metals that held a sickly sheen under torchlight. Hooks hung from vaulted ceilings. chains draped over altars made not for worship but for transformation. In alcoves along the walls rested rows of broken constructs, half-fused things of armor, flesh, and demonic anatomy, as if forge masters had been experimenting with ways to force hell into matter and matter into obedience. Scrolls littered a long stone table. Sypha moved to them at once, brushing away dust while Trevor kept guard and Hellboy tried not to punch the room apart on principle. What she found in those writings widened the mystery into horror. The rituals described they were not merely about summoning or binding demons. They were about convergence, inheritance, and enthronement. Ancient vampire magicians, working with forge masters whose craft blurred the border between necromancy and engineering, had discovered traces of a bloodline beyond their own cosmology. A Red King, a bearer of apocalyptic authority from another order of hell. Their notes speculated that Dracula's castle, already sustained by blood magic and interdimensional instability, might be harmonized with that foreign blood. If successful, the structure would cease to be only a mobile fortress or a locus of death. It would become a gate system anchored in will, a throne with architecture. Castlevania not as castle but as living mouth. Hellboy read enough of it to regret reading any of it. His name was not written, yet the outlines fit too closely to ignore. Horns as symbols of legitimacy. The stone hand is both seal and key. Resistance expected. Awakening preferred through repeated exposure to pain, infernal resonance, and environmental invocation. He hated how clinical the language was. It reduced destiny to process, apocalypse to machinery. Somewhere in another universe men had already tried to tell him what he was meant to become. Now this world, equally cursed and equally arrogant, seemed eager to continue the lecture. It got worse once they entered the castle proper. Dracula's fortress never needed ordinary logic, but now it felt almost excited. The halls shifted with a pulse like breathing. Stairs extended or shortened between steps. Portraits changed expression when Hellboy passed them, eyes brightening with awareness. Ancient doors of bronze and black wood opened on their own before the group reached them, not with welcome exactly, but with anticipation. Symbols crawled across the walls in fresh lines of ember red, writing themselves in languages Sypha could partly translate and Alucard wished he could not. One phrase repeated in variations across archway after archway, always reshaping itself like a whisper seeking the proper tone. Throne. Trevor responded the way practical men always respond when trapped inside metaphysical nonsense. He got angrier. Anger gave shape to uncertainty. It let him swing at something. Yet even he could not deny the pattern. The castle was treating Hellboy less like an intruder and more like a missing component. Sypha, for all her discipline, began glancing toward him with concern she tried not to show. Alucard walked closer than before, not because he feared Hellboy would turn on them at any moment, but because he knew how cruel it was to be claimed by the house of your enemy. At the heart of one shifting corridor they found a chapel inverted into blasphemy. Its pews had been nailed to the ceiling. Its altar was turned upside down and fused into the floor. Beneath it lay a shaft descending into red darkness. A voice rose from that depth, not loud but intimate, as if spoken from inside the stone itself. Hellboy froze. The others heard only fragments. Sypha caught syllables. Trevor heard menace. Alucard heard invitation. Hellboy heard something worse. He heard familiarity. Not a known voice, but the shape of a voice meant for him, like a title spoken by a mouth older than language. The experience unsettled him more than battle had. He could fight monsters. He could punch castles if necessary. But this was not a threat moving toward him from the outside. This was a world attempting to explain him to himself. Every kneeling creature, every self-opening door, every wall script and infernal murmur carried the same poison. You belong here. You are not wandering through this nightmare. You are part of its design. Hellboy had spent most of his life resisting exactly that kind of claim, because destiny, once accepted, tends to simplify a person into a function. He was not interested in becoming anyone's key, anyone's king, or anyone's excuse. Deeper still, they discovered the chamber where the final stages of the ritual were being prepared. It was vast, circular, and lined with machinery half mechanical and half occult, great wheels engraved with demonic alphabets turning beside channels of blood that flowed uphill into suspended reservoirs. Forge master sigils glowed between vampire runes. The floor was marked with a colossal seal divided into mirrored halves, one ancient to this world, one imported from elsewhere through shattered knowledge and sacrificial trial. In the center stood a throne shape not yet fully formed, growing out of black stone like a fossilized command. The implication was sickeningly clear. They were not trying only to awaken Hellboy. They were trying to merge his apocalyptic inheritance with the very operating soul of the castle. If they succeeded, Castlevania itself would become a living gate to hell. For a moment even Trevor had no sarcasm. Sypha stared at the unfinished throne as though the geometry offended her at a moral level. Alucard's face hardened with the cold fury of someone who realized his father's war had always been capable of becoming even more monstrous. Hellboy looked at the stone growths, the blood channels, the symbols tailored to a fate he had never accepted, and felt something rare move under his usual rough composure. Not fear exactly, because this was no longer another mission in another haunted place. This universe was trying to recruit him, trying to press his oldest wound until it opened into identity, trying to tell him that what he had resisted for years was not merely possible, but proper. That all roads led eventually to the same throne, no matter the world. Then the whisper came again from every wall at once, soft enough to make the skin crawl. Anung Un Rama, the throne is waiting. Dracula did not answer discovery with hesitation. Once the hidden chambers had been breached and the design beneath the design exposed, the response from the castle came like a body rejecting intrusion. Bells tolled somewhere high above, though no visible hands pulled them. Corridors sealed. Windows burst inward under the force of black wind. In the ruined city below the mountain, fires kindled one by one as if a signal had passed through every abandoned street at once. What had been preparation became assault. Whatever patience remained in Dracula's strategy vanished the moment Hellboy stood close enough to the unfinished ritual for the castle to taste possibility. Capture was no longer one option among several. It became the command. They reached the city by dusk and found it already waking into war. The place had once held life in proud quantity. You could still see it in the width of the avenues, the market arches, the rows of stone houses built with enough care to suggest families who once imagined futures there. Now those same streets lay broken under years of occupation and neglect. Church steeples leaned like cracked teeth. Statues had been defaced into mockery. A blood-red moon rose through drifting ash and stained every rooftop like an accusation. Trevor took one look at the skyline and muttered that he hated cities which looked like they had been cursed by interior decorators. Then the first vampire dropped from above and all room for commentary ended. They came from the roofs in waves, pale warlords wrapped in dark silk and plated armor, blades flashing silver under moonlight. Behind them poured the night creatures. Some crawled from the shell of burned churches. Some burst through cellar doors in swarming clusters. Some lumbered down the streets as forge master abominations stitched from multiple anatomies, too many joints grinding under iron harnesses. The city became a trap closing from all directions. Sypha's fire lit the avenues and sudden walls. Trevor's whip cracked across stone and flesh alike. Alucard met the descending vampires in midair with a speed that turned swordplay into cold weather. And at the center of everything, exactly where Dracula wanted him, stood Hellboy. The difference this time was intent. The enemy did not fight with the clean objective of slaughter. They wanted him alive enough to change. It revealed itself in the rhythm of the attack. Vampires fainted away from killing blows that would have ended any ordinary foe. Night creatures threw themselves at Hellboy not merely to wound, but to hold him in place. Chants rose from hidden balconies and church towers, deep infernal cadences threaded through with older demonic syllables that made the air around him feel heavy and wrong. Every cut, every spell, every impact was part of a pressure system designed to bring something out of him rather than spill something from him. The battlefield was a ritual disguised as chaos. Hellboy felt it almost immediately. His stone hand began to throb with a heat that was not pain alone but activation, as if the great carved thing were remembering it had not always been asleep. The filed stumps of his horns ached beneath the skin. More than once a wave of chanting passed through the street and his vision doubled, showing him not only the ruined city, but some deeper outline beneath it, a version of the architecture rendered in red light and thrown shadows. He hated the sensation with instinctive force. He hated that part of his body answered the call before his mind could reject it. It felt like betrayal committed by bone. He fought harder because of it. When a winged creature tried to drag him toward a cathedral door marked in infernal sigils, he ripped it from the air and smashed it through 3 columns. When a vampire captain whispered a phrase in the old tongue and drove a rune blade toward his chest, Hellboy caught the weapon in his bare hand and headbutted the captain hard enough to pulp his face inside its jeweled helm. He moved through the city like a battering ram with a temper, leaving broken monsters in walls, on pavements, and fountains long dry of water. But the more he fought, the more the ritual fed. Blood hit stone. Names were spoken. Fire traced circles he could not always see until he was already standing inside them. Trevor noticed first that something about Hellboy's movements was changing. Not weaker, more dangerous. The blows came faster, heavier, edged by an infernal force that made impact echo beyond physics. Sypha noticed the air around him shimmering with heatless distortion, as though the space itself objected to containing what was pressing outward. Alucard noticed the look in Hellboy's eyes during certain flashes of red light. Not surrender. Never that. But strain. The expression of a man forced to hear a voice he had spent years keeping buried under sarcasm and stubbornness. That was what frightened them. Not Hellboy as he was. Hellboy they had begun to understand. Rough, cynical, violent when needed, but guided by choices that kept bending toward protection. What frightened them was the possibility that Dracula had found a way to turn inheritance into momentum. Trevor had seen curses consume men before. Sypha had studied magics that did not care whether the vessel consented. Alucard knew with a depth neither of them could share what it meant to carry a father's darkness in the blood and wonder whether resistance could last forever. As the battle widened through the city's corpse like fire in dry cloth, all 3 began to realize they might soon be fighting on 2 fronts at once. Dracula's army outside, Hellboy's destiny within. The chants intensified near the central square, where a cracked statue of some forgotten saint still pointed toward heaven with a missing hand. Around its base, vampire magicians had arranged a field of bone lamps and sacrificial marks, using the square as a focusing point for the citywide assault. Hellboy felt the pull before he saw the source. Every instinct in him recoiled. His stone hand glowed with lines of molten orange beneath the carved surface. The light ran up his arm in brief pulses, synchronizing with the chanting. He stopped in the middle of the street and stared at it with an expression caught between disgust and alarm. That pause nearly killed him. A hulking abomination barreled from a side alley and drove him through the wall of a house. Timber collapsed. Dust swallowed everything. Trevor shouted his name and charged, whip blazing. Sypha called down a rain of ice spears to pin the creature in place. Alucard cut the thing open from shoulder to spine before it could press deeper into the rubble. Hellboy emerged a second later, blood at the corner of his mouth, anger radiating off him like furnace heat. He looked at his own glowing hand the way a man might look at a loaded weapon that had fired by itself. The square became the ugliest fighting of the night. Trevor took the magicians apart before they could finish their liturgy, snapping one neck with the whip handle and kicking another into his own ritual lamps. Sypha burst the bone circles and rings of fire and shattered the saint's pedestal with a lance of ice. Alucard met a cluster of vampire nobles in a whirl of steel so fast their bodies seemed to realize death in sequence. Hellboy reached the center last, then drove the right hand of doom into the cracked stones. The whole plaza exploded upward. Sigils broke. The chant collapsed into screams. But broken ritual is not always failed ritual. Sometimes it merely changes form. The shockwave threw everyone back, Hellboy most of all. For one terrible second, the red light gathered around him instead of dispersing. Images flashed through his mind with the intimacy of memory. A throne built from ruin. A crown of fire. Humanity kneeling not in love or gratitude but in absolute terror. A world where monsters no longer hid because the world itself had finally become theirs. Dracula standing beside that vision not as rival but as witness. It lasted only a heartbeat. That was long enough. When Hellboy regained focus, Trevor and Sypha were staring at him from across the smoking square. Not with condemnation, with worry. Alucard alone managed something closer to understanding because he had seen that same haunted look in mirrors after dreams of his father. The city around them continued to burn. Bells rang again. More enemies gathered in the dark approaches. Hellboy flexed his stone hand once, and the molten lines beneath its surface dimmed but did not disappear. He breathed out slowly, as if patience might somehow insult whatever ancient power was trying to climb through him. Then he looked at the glow with honest irritation, the kind that survives even at the edge of prophecy. "That's new," he muttered. "And I really don't like new. There are moments before a final battle when the world seems to inhale and refuse to exhale. After the ruined city, after the blood-red moon and the failed square ritual and the sight of Hellboy's stone hand glowing like a furnace seal, that stillness settled over the survivors with almost sacred weight. They found refuge in the shell of an abandoned chapel half buried by ivy and time, far enough from the main roads that only the wind and distant thunder could reach it. Its roof had collapsed years before, leaving the nave open to the black sky. Rain drifted through broken arches. Saintly faces had been eroded from the walls until even holiness looked tired. Trevor and Sypha moved to the far end to prepare weapons, maps, and whatever remained of a plan. Hellboy sat near the ruined altar, elbows on knees, stone hand hanging heavy between them. Across from him, in the hush where prayers had once lived, stood Alucard. The silence between them was not awkward. It was earned. Some people speak easily because they need the noise. Others wait because speech means something. Alucard belonged to the second kind. So, in a rougher way, did Hellboy. Outside the shattered chapel windows, lightning flashed over Dracula's distant castle and showed it rising through the storm like the spine of a dead god. Every flash made the future feel closer. Every pause between thunder gave room for older fears. It was Alucard who finally broke the quiet. "My father believes blood is destiny," he said. "Not always as poetry. Sometimes simply as arithmetic." Hellboy gave a low grunt that might have been agreement. Arithmetic was exactly how the universe liked to discuss his future, too. Add demon blood to prophesy, subtract free will, arrive at apocalypse. Clean equation. Bad answer. Alucard stepped nearer the broken altar and looked down at the stone floor where rainwater had pooled in the carved cracks. "My mother believed the opposite," he said. "She believed what one chooses under pressure matters more than what one inherits in comfort. I have lived between those beliefs for most of my life. Some days I know which one I serve. Some days I wonder whether certainty itself is a luxury." The honesty in it changed the air. Alucard was not confessing weakness for drama. He was naming the private terror that lives inside all sons of darkness. The fear that cruelty is not merely an influence but a dormant structure. That somewhere beneath discipline, kindness, and reason waits the same appetite that ruined the father. He had fought Dracula. He had rejected him. He had chosen humanity against his own blood. Yet choice once made is not choice finished. It must be made again and again, especially when the world keeps providing reasons to give up on it. Hellboy leaned back slightly and looked at him through the rain. "You worried you got some of him in you," he said. Alucard's expression did not change, but that lack of change was answer enough. "Sometimes," he said, "I think I recognize his anger too easily. Sometimes I understand him in ways I wish I did not. And when understanding comes too readily, I wonder whether I am resisting him or merely delaying resemblance." Hellboy let that sit for a moment. He knew the shape of the question. He had carried it under different names for years. Was he protecting the world from what he might become, or just postponing the day everyone else turned out to be right? The trouble with monstrous inheritance is that it teaches you to examine even your virtues for cracks. A violent man protecting the innocent can still wonder whether he merely enjoys violence. A feared outcast defending humanity can still suspect he is trying to earn permission to belong. Blood makes philosophers of the unwilling. He looked down at the right hand of doom. The glow was gone for now, but memory of it remained like heat trapped in stone. Then he shrugged, not because the subject was light, but because shrugging was sometimes the only way to keep it from becoming holy. "Blood is not choice," he said. "Just because something is in you doesn't mean it gets a vote." Alucard watched him carefully. Easy to say, perhaps, when one has lived defying it. Hellboy gave a dry laugh. "Nothing easy about it. You just do it enough times that people start thinking you got a philosophy. Truth is, destiny's just another chain. Fancy one, sure. Covered in prophecy and old dead languages. Still a chain. You either drag it around or one day you break the damn thing." That rough honesty landed with more force than grand speeches ever could have. Alucard had spent much of his life in the company of eloquent men, doomed men, brilliant men who could justify misery in 3 languages and call it wisdom. Hellboy offered none of that. He spoke like a man who distrusted abstractions because abstractions had spent years trying to turn him into an object. There was freedom in that bluntness. Not comfort exactly, but clarity. For the first time that night, Alucard's mouth hinted at something almost like a smile. "My mother would have approved of that answer," he said. "Yeah," Hellboy muttered. "She sounds smart." At the far end of the chapel, Trevor pretended not to listen while very obviously listening. Sypha met his eye and said nothing. They understood, perhaps more than either solitary man wished, that this conversation was not incidental. It was the emotional hinge beneath the coming war. The son of hell and the son of Dracula sitting in a roofless chapel while rain crossed broken saints, discussing whether inheritance could be outlived. In another story, the symbolism would have been embarrassing. In this world, it felt almost painfully honest. Then the castle answered. The ground trembled beneath the chapel first, shaking dust from the cracked walls. Outside, the storm tightened into a single spiraling mass above Dracula's fortress. Lightning no longer flashed at random. It converged. Black clouds folded inward as though some colossal mouth had begun drawing breath from the whole horizon. Sypha rose immediately and hurried to the broken doorway. Trevor followed, sword already in hand. Hellboy and Alucard stepped into the rain and looked toward the mountain. Castlevania was rising, not metaphorically, not in the emotional way old evils rise when power gathers around them. The castle itself was lifting, stone grinding against stone, foundations tearing free from the mountain as hidden engines and impossible geometries awakened below. Towers climbed higher into the storm. Bridges unfolded like ribs. Red light pulsed through windows that had been dark a moment earlier. Across the valleys and forests, answering cries rose from every quarter of the land. Night creatures, thousands of them, crawling, flying toward the fortress from all directions as if some buried command had reached every abomination at once. Dracula had begun the final ritual. Sypha felt the change in the atmosphere like poison diffusing through water. "The air between worlds is thinning," she said, voice low with alarm. "Not just summoning." Trevor looked at Hellboy when she said it. He did not mean to. It happened because everyone knew what the castle wanted now, and because fear, once earned, does not disappear simply because friendship has begun. Hellboy noticed the glance and did not blame him for it. That was the problem. He understood too much lately. The world kept making horror reasonable. Alucard saw that exchange and stepped between interpretation and injury before either could harden. "Then we end it before the opening completes," he said, not as hope. He sounded more like his father when he spoke with that kind of command, and perhaps he knew it. Perhaps that was part of the cost. The horizon darkened further. Not night dark, something thicker, something with intention. Birds dropped from the sky in distant flurries. Wolves fled the tree line. The chapel's remaining stained glass vibrated, then shattered inward. From somewhere inside the rising castle came a sound too low to be called thunder and too organized to be natural. Hellboy felt it behind his eyes. The call was not for the army alone. It was for him. He could tell now. All of it had been for him in one way or another. The kneeling creatures, the unfinished throne. The universe was narrowing toward choice. He looked again at Alucard, pale in the storm, carrying a father's shadow without surrendering his own face. The symmetry between them no longer felt clever. It felt necessary. One was born from Dracula and denied the inheritance of cruelty. The other was born for apocalypse and kept refusing every cosmic script handed to him. If either of them failed now, blood would win an argument it had been trying to make for generations. Far above, the castle's highest tower pierced the center of the storm. Red light spilled downward like a wound reopening in the sky. In its depths, somewhere beyond sight, Dracula stood beneath vaulted stone and ancient machinery and began the last invocation. His voice traveled through the awakened fortress, through the marching hordes, through every crack in the dark. Let hell answer the call. The assault on Dracula's castle felt less like entering a fortress and more like being swallowed by an argument the world had been building for centuries. The gates did not simply open. They unfolded. Black iron peeled back from blacker stone, revealing corridors lit by pulsing red seams in the walls as if the castle had veins and had decided there was no longer any reason to hide them. Hellboy, Trevor, Sypha, and Alucard crossed the threshold together while the storm howled outside and the armies of night converged below. Behind them lay a cursed land waiting to see whether dawn would ever be allowed back. Ahead lay a living structure hungry enough to turn prophecy into architecture. The castle moved around them immediately. Passages lengthened after they entered. Stairs bent sideways. Doors that should have led to towers opened instead into caverns of bone lined with blood-lit glass. Trevor swore that the place was cheating, which in his vocabulary was a form of respect. Sypha used bursts of fire to test illusions and reveal hidden seams. Alucard navigated by instinct and childhood memory, only to find memory itself betraying him as hallways rewrote their own logic. Hellboy walked at the center because every time the castle shifted, it shifted hardest around him. Statues turned their heads to follow his steps. Demonic reliefs carved into the walls brightened with ember eyes. More than once, the floor beneath his boots formed symbols for an instant before breaking apart again. The enemies came in layers. First the vampire generals. Not common soldiers, not scouts, but the elegant killers entrusted with command in a war built on superiority and contempt. They emerged from balconies and mirrored chambers wearing armor etched with old heraldry and carrying blades that hissed with poison or sorcery. Trevor met them with brutal practicality, whips snapping through the dimness like judgment made audible. Sypha shattered formations with ice and sealed corridors with fire, turning the castle's own claustrophobia against its defenders. Alucard fought his father's nobles in duels that looked almost ceremonial until the blood began to fall. Hellboy did not duel. He broke. When one general tried to pin him beneath a spear of black steel and speak some final temptation into his ear, Hellboy tore the weapon free, punched through the general's chest, and used the corpse to knock another from a staircase into an open shaft. Then came the night creature armies. Not as a single horde, but as flood after flood through impossible routes. They crawled from wall cavities, dropped from ceiling vaults, burst through paintings, fireplaces, chapel floors. The castle had become a breeding thought, manufacturing angles of attack faster than the group could clear them. Living walls pushed inward with screaming faces trapped beneath the stone. Infernal traps ignited beneath their boots in circles of red flame and thorned chains. Demonic statues woke from stillness and lumbered into combat with axes grown from their own arms. In one gallery, blood magic rituals continued even as battle raged, robed figures chanting around bowls of black fire, while the paintings behind them bled from the eyes. It was exactly what Castlevania had always threatened to become under enough pressure. Not a building, a nightmare machine. And inside that machine, Hellboy's worst fight was never purely physical. The visions began at irregular intervals, each triggered by impact, sigil light, or the castle's direct attempt to synchronize with what lived in his blood. Sometimes he saw them in reflections, sometimes in the red-polished stone beneath his feet, sometimes simply behind his eyes after striking a creature hard enough to split bone and mortar alike. He saw himself crowned in fire. Horns restored, longer and nobler than before, rising from his head with ancient authority. He saw humanity kneeling in endless ranks across a deadened earth while vast gates opened behind a throne of ruin. He saw monsters not hiding in caves, forests, and catacombs, but standing openly in daylight because daylight itself had become theirs. In those visions, Dracula did not always stand above him. Often he stood beside him, not as master but as witness to an order finally honest about what ruled it. The temptation was not simple power. That would have been easier to dismiss. It was belonging. A world where he would never again have to prove that the shape of his body did not define the shape of his choices. A world where monsters had won the argument and could stop apologizing for existing. The visions pressed exactly where his life had left bruises. They offered certainty to a man long burdened by suspicion. They offered identity without negotiation. That was why they were dangerous. Each time, Hellboy rejected them with violence. He smashed the mirrors that showed them, tore sigils from the floor with the right hand of doom, shot cultists mid-chant before their voices could finish forming the old tongue. Once he rammed his glowing stone fist straight through the jaw of a demonic statue because its face had briefly worn his own future crown. He had been raised not by destiny, not by hell, not by prophets, but by people who told him choice mattered even when the world made that choice lonely. He had spent too many years earning the right to remain himself. He was not going to surrender that effort now because a castle offered him the cheap narcotic of inevitability. Trevor saw the struggle more clearly than he wanted. He had mocked prophecy often enough, but mockery grows thin when the prophecy starts answering back. Sypha fought to keep the path open while measuring how close Hellboy was to some threshold she could not name. Alucard, above all, recognized the look of inherited darkness trying to make itself sound reasonable. More than once he put himself between Hellboy and an active ritual, not because he feared Hellboy might attack them, but because he knew some battles required a witness who understood. They cut upward and inward through the castle's warping interior until at last the fighting began to funnel rather than scatter. The architecture wanted that. All nightmares eventually seek a center. Corridors lined with burning tapestries bent toward a vast ascent of black steps. The living walls grew still. The statues stopped moving and watched. Even the night creatures withdrew, as though the next chamber belonged to older authority. At the top of that ascent stood the throne room, its doors taller than chapel facades, engraved with scenes of conquest, mourning, and divine punishment twisted into one continuous history. Those doors opened before they touched them. Inside waited the final space. Not the unfinished ritual chamber they had discovered below, but its perfected answer. The throne room was immense, ceiling lost in red-lit shadow, pillars shaped like bundled bones rising around a floor inlaid with infernal geometry. At the far end, framed by stormlight pouring through a broken wall of stained glass, stood Dracula. He did not posture. He did not snarl. He stood with the terrible dignity of a king who had carried grief so long it had become statecraft. Behind him the ritual burned through channels in the stone. Beneath him the castle throbbed like a heart near rupture. Around him hung the final temptation. His gaze settled on Hellboy and held. The others spread instinctively, readying blade, flame, whip, and spell. But Dr. Dracula's attention remained where the castle's attention had always remained. On the red demon who had refused every invitation so far. "Accept what you are," Dracula said, and the chamber seemed to listen with him. "Or continue pretending you are a man." Hellboy stepped forward through the glow of the living sigils. The visions pulled at him one last time. Fire crown, open gates, kneeling world. A throne that fit the outline of his absence. He thought of every suspicious stare, every child he had still chosen to save, every warning that blood would decide for him in the end. Then he looked at Dracula, at the man who had let grief teach him obedience to despair, and felt something in himself settle like a bolt sliding home. He raised the right hand of doom. "I know what I am," he said. "I'm the guy who says no." What followed was not a duel in the graceful sense old songs prefer. It was too heavy for that, too personal, too loaded with grief, prophecy, and exhausted refusal. Dracula moved first with speed that mocked his stillness, crossing the throne chamber in a blur of dark cloth and ancient violence. Hellboy met him with the right hand of doom, and the impact cracked the floor in rings of ember-lit stone. Sypha's fire surged along the chamber edges. Trevor's whip snapped through the air toward the active ritual channels. Alucard launched at his father with sword bright as judgment. Yet even with all four of them moving, the room belonged at its center to the collision between two monstrous futures. Dracula fought like mourning given perfect technique. There was nothing wild in him. Rage had been honed too long to remain chaotic. Every strike carried strength enough to kill and precision enough to make that death feel inevitable. He used sorcery not as decoration but extension, red arcs of force and storms of blood-edged glass turning the very air into a weapon. Hellboy answered with stubborn brutality, each punch, block, and thrown object declaring the same simple truth in 100 physical languages. No to inheritance, no to manipulation. No to every cosmic bureaucrat who looked at his bloodline and assumed the paperwork of doom had already been signed. Trevor and Sypha worked the ritual while Alucard kept re-entering the duel whenever he could create an opening. Trevor shattered anchor stones with the morning star, cursing like a man personally offended by metaphysics. Sypha froze blood channels and burst them apart with spears of ice and pillars of flame. Alucard fought his father not only with skill but with history. Every exchange between them burdened by all the unlived years that should have been family instead of war. Yet Dracula would not divide his will for long. Again and again his attention returned to Hellboy, because Hellboy was the axis now. Break him, awaken him, enthrone him, and every other resistance became temporary. The throne room shook as the infernal gateway began to open beneath it. At first it was a fissure in the ritual floor, a seam of red-black light splitting the geometry down the middle. Then the seam widened into depth. Heat poured upward, but not ordinary heat. It was the temperature of old commands, of kingdoms ending, of names spoken in places too deep for sunlight ever to have existed. The castle responded with ecstatic violence. Pillars cracked and regrew through themselves. The stained glass exploded outward. The storm outside folded into a single rotating eye above the throne chamber. All across the fortress, bells rang without rhythm, and from far below came the cries of night creatures thrown into religious frenzy by the nearness of what was opening. Hellboy felt the gateway in his bones. His filed horns ached first, then split the skin at their edges as if something beneath them were trying to remember the shape it had been denied. He staggered for one dangerous instant. Dracula saw it and pressed forward with terrible hope. A strike of dark force hammered Hellboy across the chamber into the half-formed throne structure beside the ritual core. Stone shattered around him. When he rose, blood ran down his face in narrow lines, and the broken horn stumps had begun to grow. Trevor saw and swore. Sypha saw and stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. Alucard saw and understood exactly how narrow the line had become. Behind Hellboy, out of the widening gate, the image of a throne appeared in fire and shadow. Not fully solid, not fully illusion. An archetype forcing itself into matter. It towered above the chamber like a promise made by hell to itself. Every whisper the castle had fed him now concentrated into one terrible invitation. Sit. Stop fighting what the universe has already written. The air thickened with obedience. Even the living walls went silent, as if the whole structure waited to see whether its chosen king would finally recognize his seat. Dracula did not mock him then. That would have cheapened the moment. Instead, his voice lowered, and for the first time there was something almost like pleading buried beneath command. "Why resist a world that has never wanted you?" he said. "Why bleed for those who fear your face? Take the truth offered to you. In their cruelty, in their judgment, in them." That was the final temptation, and it was cruel because it was not built from lies alone. Humanity had feared Hellboy, judged him, misunderstood him, used him when convenient and doubted him when easy. The world across worlds had supplied him with enough reasons to grow bitter. Dracula was offering not simple dominion but revenge wrapped in vindication. Become what they always feared and make their fear retroactively correct. There is a dark satisfaction in that thought, a neatness, a perverse justice. Hellboy looked at the throne, at the gate, at his regrowing horns reflected in the fractured black glass of the chamber floor. Then he looked past all of it and saw, not the species in abstract, but people. Frightened villagers on muddy roads, children hiding in wagons, a woman reaching to thank him and flinching before contact, Trevor choosing trust despite every instinct toward suspicion, Sypha studying him carefully and staying anyway. Alucard carrying his father's shadow without kneeling beneath it. Humanity had never been clean. It had never been simple. But it had also never been reducible to the worst of its fear. He spat blood to one side and straightened. "You know what your problem is," he said to Dracula, voice rough with pain and contempt. "You think being hurt gives you permission." Then he moved, not toward the throne, through it. Hellboy drove the right hand of doom straight into the ritual core beneath the apparition. Not with the accepting touch the gate demanded, but with the force of a hammer turned against its own maker. The chamber screamed. There is no better word. Stone screamed. Metal screamed. The gateway screamed in a language older than mouths. The right hand had been built for endings, but every power imagines its purpose belongs to the one who defined it first. Hellboy rejected that definition the same way he had rejected every other. If the hand was meant to open the apocalypse, then he would use it to break the lock instead. The infernal gate shattered. Light and darkness erupted together. The explosion tore through the throne room, through the castle, through the ritual channels braided beneath the mountain. Dracula was thrown backward into a collapsing column of bone-carved stone. Vampire sigils went dead all across the fortress. The marching armies outside faltered as if a string had snapped inside their minds. Trevor covered Sypha with his body as flame and debris rolled past. Alucard drove his sword into the floor to keep from being hurled into the abyss where the gate had been. Hellboy vanished inside the blast for one endless second while the throne behind him broke apart into cinders and screaming shadows. Then the collapse began in earnest. Castlevania, denied its transformation, started dying by pieces. Towers split. Bridges fell away into the storm. Walls that had lived too long on blood and magic lost the strength to remember their own shape. Dracula rose once more through the ruin, grievously wounded, eyes filled not with surprise but with the bitter recognition of a man watching another choose the road he himself abandoned long ago. There was no grand speech left in him, no second temptation, only the echo of defeat. By the time dawn touched the mountains, the castle was broken and the sky was changing color for the first time in what felt like an age. The surviving villagers who crept from forest edges and cellar mouths found ruins still smoking, monsters dead or fled, and at the center of the wreckage a red figure standing alone among fallen stone. His horns were broken back down. His coat was torn. His skin was streaked with ash and blood. He looked, to frightened eyes, no less monstrous than before, and yet some of them bowed their heads. Not all. Fear never vanishes in one sunrise. But respect had entered the space where only terror had lived. Hellboy did not ask for gratitude. He did not wait for blessing, title, or belonging. He lit a cigar with scorched fingers, looked at the sunrise painting gold across the ruins of Dracula's world, and turned away before anyone could try to make him into a king. And in a world ruled by vampires, demons, and cursed blood, the greatest monster was the one who chose to be a man.